We never had such wide-scale massacres committed by the South African apartheid government, as the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. So when you have such moral authorities making this comparison and saying it's much, much worse in the Israeli case, it rang a bell with people. People in the civil rights movement in the US started seeing comparisons. Alice Walker is among the most famous in doing so. When she came out in support of BDS, she compared with the Rosa Parks initiated boycott that Martin Luther King led, the bus boycott and so on. So she made that connection and brought this home to a wide public in the US that wouldn't have made any connection. What does civil rights in the US have to do with the Palestinian BDS movement? So Alice Walker was among the first to make this very solid connection, I think. So between South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, and the US civil rights movement, the connections started to become much more popular, much more publicized and mainstream. Since the attack on the flotilla, the Freedom Flotilla, which was on May 31st of last year, since that bloody attack where 9 activists were killed, the cultural boycott really took off. I mean, if there's any one threshold that we can point to historically after 5 years, historians will say that was the moment when cultural boycott really took off, was May 31st, 2010, the flotilla attack. After the flotilla attack, and for some peculiar reason, suddenly all these bands and all these cultural figures became very supportive of BDS. So we had world best-selling authors, Henry Mankell, Ian Banks, and of course Alice Walker in that period too. Then the Pixies and Costello and Gil Scott-Heron boycotted, and then Meg Ryan and Dustin Hoffman, and so on and so forth. It really started snowballing since May 31st until Roger Waters of Pink Floyd came out just recently, in March, I think of this year, in The Guardian, and supported BDS openly. And he was the first big mega star to support BDS openly. But we also had Mike Lee, the Jewish, British, very famous filmmaker and writer, boycotting a festival in Tel Aviv, a conference in Tel Aviv, and also coming out and saying, I was duped by Zionism. He was a Zionist all his life, and he said, I was duped by Zionism. They made us shut our eyes to the sufferings of the Palestinian people and to make everything justifiable by what Jews had undergone in Europe. And for someone like Mike Lee to say that, not your typical anti-Zionist lefty Jew, a very establishment Zionist Jewish huge cultural figure in Britain. It was very effective to the British public, especially the Jewish public in Britain. Talking about Jews and Jewish publics, after the flotilla attack, many Jewish persons and groups got off their fence. I mean, they were sitting on the fence for way too long, saying, oh, we cannot take sides, yes, we don't like occupation, but Israel needs our protection and our voice. They came off the fence. I mean, that was untenable to continue playing that immoral position, in my view, critical immoral position of saying, oh, I'm against occupation, but I love Israel. Well, what does that mean? Palestinians cannot understand that. I'm against occupation, but I love Israel. What the hell do you love about Israel today? I mean, how can anyone with any moral consistency love Israel? They either come and say, we're Zionists and we couldn't care less about Palestinian rights. You're subhuman and we couldn't care less about your suffering and your tragedy and what Israel is committing against you. We care first and foremost about protecting Israeli apartheid. Because those who say we want to protect Israel as a Jewish state, what are they saying? What country has a right to have an exclusionary identity? Jewish state, Christian state, a white state, Muslim state, whatever state that excludes others on the basis of identity is a racist state by definition. And anyone defending that is a racist. Pure and simple. There is no other justification for defending Israel as a Jewish state except racism. Just like anyone who defends any exclusionary state, Hindu, Muslim, whatever it may be. And again, imagine the equivalent in the US for the majority to come out and say, well, we want the US, and you have your fair share of nuts in the US that are saying this, we need the US to be a Christian state. Really, and the Bible to be our constitution. And others, they can continue to live here, but they can't get total rights. I mean, they can't run for president, they can't be dominant. It really has to be a Christian state. Those others are really destroying our cultural fabric, our identity. This land was built by those white, wonderful European pioneers who came and discovered it, and so on and so forth, this whole mythology. Why wouldn't they say that? I mean, they're defending that in Israel. Why wouldn't they say, those Christian fundamentalists, why wouldn't they say that in the US as well? But the strange thing is not the nutty Christian fundamentalists, it's the Jewish Zionists who are the hypocrites. Those fundamentalists are not hypocrites. I mean, they're very consistent. They're waiting for the Messiah, and then in the meanwhile, let's move every Jew to Israel so that when the Messiah comes, they all die. They're very open about their agenda. They either convert to Christianity or they die. So the best way to kill them all is get them all to Israel. There's open anti-Semitic, as anti-Semitic as it gets. And they're Israel's best friend in the US, biggest friend in the US as well. I mean, AIPAC is much smaller than the Christian Zionist lobby in terms of numbers, not influence, but numbers. But it's the Jewish Zionists who are the true hypocrites, who still say we defend civil rights in the US, we want equal rights in the US, but in Israel, we love apartheid in the US. In Israel, we love apartheid. We want to protect Israel as an apartheid state. I.F. Stone, the famous Jewish American writer, as far back as 1968, if I'm not mistaken, was the first, as far as I know, who raised this hypocrisy, who said American Jews are at the forefront of the civil rights movements calling for equal rights, together with blacks at the time. But in Israel, they're defending laws that prevent mixed marriages. They're defending the most racist reality in Israel. And this is sheer hypocrisy. And this hypocrisy continues today. But why are we using this term apartheid to describe Israel? I mean, some people will jump and say, well, Israel is so different than South Africa, as I myself and many, many others have acknowledged. So why are we saying Israel is an apartheid state? Well, apartheid has nothing to do with South Africa. There's no monopoly on the term apartheid in South Africa. It's a universal crime that existed in South Africa, but it was defined by UN conventions. There's the Convention for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid that was passed by the General Assembly, UN General Assembly in 1973 and went into effect in 1976. It defines the crime of apartheid. More recently, the 2002 Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, the ICC, defined apartheid in very clear terms as a system of institutionalized, legalized oppression by one racial group to another. So it has nothing to do with South Africa. You don't have to prove identity or closeness to South Africa to show that any state is an apartheid state. So the US was an apartheid state. The southern states were actually committing the crime of apartheid, but we just did not have the term then to call it apartheid. When they had different laws applying to whites and non-whites, coloreds, blacks, and so on, that was apartheid because it wasn't racism, it was institutionalized, legalized racial discrimination. Racism exists today everywhere, in democratic countries, so-called democratic countries, and everywhere else. So Israel is not unique in that sense, but we're not talking about racism, we're talking about institutionalized, legalized racial discrimination. And that's what Israel has. And many people don't know that even the US State Department issues an annual human rights report, as some of you may know, and every single year, this report condemns Israel legal, institutional, societal discrimination against its minority. Every single year. They call it US State Department, the State Department, in their human rights report issued. So if you Google that, legal, societal, institutional discrimination, US State Department, you'll find it. It's against Israel. Every single year. So even the US State Department indirectly is admitting that Israel is an apartheid state. But who's the US to judge human rights? That's another story. But even the US State Department says that. Because of all this, we felt that boycotts, divestments, and sanctions were the most effective, non-violent, peaceful means of resisting Israeli occupation, colonization, and apartheid, as well as solidarity, especially for solidarity movements. Today, solidarity groups that are not doing BDS are not doing solidarity. At least not solidarity with the Palestinians. solidarity with some version of Israeli apartheid, solidarity with themselves, solidarity with Mars, or dolphins, but not with us. Today, those who are not doing BDS are not doing solidarity with that side. Simple. I mean, they could be doing other things, that's fine, but those who still today refuse to adopt BDS are not doing solidarity with us. They don't have to endorse BDS yet, but to accept that we have 3 basic rights under international law, and to do boycott, divestment, sanctions tactics, to adopt those tactics, even if they have not yet endorsed BDS as a cause. That's okay, as long as they're doing BDS and accepting the basic rights-based approach of the BDS movement. Another aspect of the BDS movement that's not often talked about, and you won't hear much about it in the mainstream media, is the Israeli component of the